Okay, this is Into the Unknown, Chapter 1, Section 5, the second half. We're starting on page 25, down at the bottom where it says, at first. Okay? At first, the ascent was very hard work, and it will readily be understood that the 6 tired men were not sorry on their first night of journey to crawl into their sleeping bags after first refreshing the inner man with a cup after cup of hot tea. Yet, notwithstanding all the fatigue they had undergone, there was so much strength left in them that Dietrichson volunteered to go back and fetch a piece of Gyr cheese they had left behind when halting for their midday meal. It would be a nice little morning walk, he said, before turning in. And he actually went, all for the sake of a precious bit of cheese. The next day, there was a pouring rain that wet them through. The work of hauling the sleighs, however, kept them warm, but later in the evening it came down in such torrents that Nansen deemed it advisable to pitch the tent, and here they remained weather-bound for 3 whole days, and long days they were. On the forenoon of the 20th, however, the weather improved, and our travelers again set out on their journey, having first indulged in a good warm meal by way of recompense for their 3 days' fasting. The ice at first was very difficult, so much so that they had to retrace their steps and, sitting on their sleighs, slide down the mountain slope. But the going improved, as also did the weather. If it would only freeze a little, sighed Nansen, but he was to get enough of frost before long. On they tramped, under a broiling sun, over the slushy snow. As there was no drinking water to be had, they filled their flasks with snow, carrying them in their breast pocket for the heat of their bodies to melt it. On August 22nd, there was a night frost. The snow was hard and in good condition, but the surface so rough and full of lumps and frozen waves of slush that the ropes with which they dragged the sleighs cut and chafed their shoulders. It was just as if our shoulders were being burned, Balto said. They now traveled mostly by night, for it was better going then and there was no sun to broil them, while the aurora borealis, bathing as if it were the whole of the frozen plain in a flood of silvery light, inspired them with fresh courage. The surface of the ice over which they traveled was as smooth and even as a lake newly frozen over. As they got into higher altitudes, the cold at night became more intense. Occasionally, they were overtaken by a snowstorm, and they had to encamp in order to avoid being frozen to death. While at times, again, the going would become so heavy in the fine drifting snow that they had to drag their sleighs one by one, 3 or 4 men at a time to each sleigh, an operation involving such tremendous exertion that Christensen, a man of few words, on one such occasion said to Nansen, "What fools people must be to let themselves in for work like this." To give some idea of the intense cold they had to encounter, it may be stated that at the highest altitude they reached 9,272 feet above the sea, the temperature fell to below negative 49 degrees Fahrenheit, and this too in the tent at night, the thermometer being under Nansen's pillow. And all this toil and labor, be it remembered, went on from August 1st to the end of September, with sleighs weighing on an average about 220 pounds each in drifting snow dust, worse than even in the sandstorms of the Sahara. In order to lighten their labor, Nansen resolved to use sails on the sleigh, a proceeding which Balto highly disapproved of. Sails, however, were forthcoming, notwithstanding Balto's objections, and they sat and stitched them with frozen fingers in the midst of the snow. But it was astonishing what a help they proved to be, and so they proceeded on their way, after slightly altering their course in the direction of Godthab. Thus, then, we see these solitary beings, looking like dark spots moving on an infinite expanse of snow, wending their way ever onward, Nansen and Sverdrup side by side, ski staff and ice axe in hand in front, earnestly gazing ahead as they dragged the heavy sleigh, while close behind followed Dietrichson and Christensen, Balto and Ravna bringing up the rear, each dragging a smaller sleigh. So it went on for weeks, and though it tried their strength and put their powers of endurance to a most severe test, yet, if ever the thought of giving it up arose in their minds, it was at once scouted out by all the party, the 2 Lapps excepted. One day, Balto complained loudly to Nansen. "When you asked us," he said, "in Christiana, what weight we could drag, we told you we could manage 100 weight each. But now we have double that weight, and all that I can say is that if we drag these loads over to the west coast, we are stronger than horses." Onward, however, they went, in spite of the cold, which at times was so intense that their beards froze fast to their jerseys, facing blinding snowstorms that well nigh made old Ravna desperate. The only bright moments they enjoyed were when sleeping or at their meals. The sleeping bags, indeed, were a paradise, their meals ideals of perfect bliss. Unfortunately, Nansen had not taken a sufficient supply of fatty food with him, and to such an extent did the craving for fat go that Sverdrup one day seriously suggested that they should eat boot grease, a compound of boiled grease and old linseed oil. Finally, on September 14th, they had reached their highest altitude and began to descend towards the coast, keeping a sharp lookout for land ahead. But none was yet to be seen, and one day Ravna's patience completely gave way. With sobs and moans, he said to Nansen, "I'm an old field Lapp and a silly old fool. I'm sure we shall never get to the coast." One day, however, shortly afterward, while they were at dinner, they heard the twittering of a bird close by. It was a snow bunting, bringing them a greeting from the west coast, and their hearts grew warm within them at the welcome sound. On the next day, with sails set, they proceeded onward down the sloping ground, but with only partial success. Nansen was standing behind the large sleigh to steady it, while Sverdrup steered from the front. Merrily flew the bark, but unfortunately Nansen stumbled and fell, and had hard work to regain his legs, and harder work still to gather up sundry articles that had fallen off the sleigh, such as boxes of pemmican, fur jackets, and ice axes. Meanwhile, Sverdrup and the ship had almost disappeared from view, and all that Nansen could see of it was a dark square speck far ahead across the ice. Sverdrup had been sitting all the while in front, thinking what an admirable passage they were making, and was not a little astonished on looking behind to find that he was the only passenger on board. Matters, however, went on better after this, and in the afternoon, as they were sailing their best and fastest, the joyful cry of "Land ahead!" rang through the air. The west coast was in sight. After several days' hard work across fissures and over uneven ice, the coast itself was finally reached. But Godthab was a long, long way off still, and to reach it by land was a sheer impossibility. The joy of our travelers on once more feeling firm ground beneath their feet, and of getting real water to drink, was indescribable. They swallowed quart after quart till they could drink no more. The Lapps, as usual, took themselves off to the field to testify their joy, which means plateau. That's what it says in parentheses. That evening was the most delightful one that they had experienced for weeks, one never to be forgotten in, after years when, with their tent pitched and blazing fire of wood, they sat beside it, Sverdrup smoking a pipe of moss in lieu of tobacco, and Nansen lying on his back in the grass, which shed a strange and delightful perfume all around. But how was Godthab to be reached? By land was impossible, therefore the journey must be made by sea. But there was no boat. A boat, then, must be built, and Sverdrup and Nansen were the men to solve the problem. They set to work, and by evening the boat was finished. Its dimensions were 8 feet 5 inches in length, 4 feet 8 inches in breadth, and it was made of willows and sailcloth. The oars were of bamboo and willow branches, across the blades of which canvas was stretched. The thwarts were made from bamboo, and the foot of one of their scientific instruments, which, by the way, chafed them terribly, and were very uncomfortable seats. All preparations being now made, Nansen and Sverdrup set off on their adventurous journey. The first day it was terribly hard work, for the water was too shallow to admit of rowing. On the second day, however, they put out to sea. Here they had at times to encounter severe weather, fearing every moment lest their frail bark should be swamped or capsized. At night they would sleep on the naked shore beneath the open sky. From morning till night they struggled away with their oars, living on hot soup and the seabirds they shot, which were ravenously devoured without much labor being devoted to cooking the same. Finally they reached their destination, meeting with a hearty welcome, accompanied by a salute from the cannon fired off in their honor, when once it was ascertained who the new arrivals were. Nansen's first inquiry about a ship for Denmark, and then he learned, to his great disappointment, that the last vessel for the season had sailed from Gotthab 2 months before, and that this nearest ship, the Fox, was lying at Ivitgut, 300 miles off. It was a terrible blow in the midst of their joy. Home had, as it were, at one stroke receded many hundreds of miles away, and here they would have to pass a whole winter and spring, while dear ones at home would think they had perished and would be mourning for their supposed loss all those weary months. But this must never be. The Fox must be got at, and friends at home must, at all events, get letters by her. After a great deal of trouble, Nansen at a length found an Eskimo who agreed to set off on his kayak bearing 2 letters. One was from Nansen to Gamel, who had equipped the expedition, the other from Sverdrup to his father. This having been arranged, and the boats having been sent off to fetch their comrades from like fjord, Nansen and Sverdrup plunged into all the joys and delights of civilized life to which they had so long been strangers. Now they were able to indulge in the luxury of soap and water for the first time since their commencement of their journey across the ice. To change their clothes, to sleep in proper beds, to eat civilized food with knives and forks on earthenware plates, to smoke, to converse with educated beings, was to them the summum bonum of enjoyment, and they felt themselves to be in clover. At last, on October 12th, the other members of the expedition joined them, and these 6 men who had risked their lives in that perilous adventure were once more assembled together. His object had been attained, and the name of Fridtjof Nansen would soon be known the whole world over. That same autumn, the Fox brought to Norway tidings of the success of the expedition, and a few hours after her revival, the telegraph announced throughout the length and breadth of the civilized world, in few but significant words, Fridtjof Nansen has crossed over the inland ice of Greenland. And the Norwegian nation, which had refused to grant the venturesome young man 5,000 kroner, now raised her head and called Fridtjof Nansen one of her best sons. And when one day in April, having spent a long winter in Greenland, he went on board the Hivsborn on his homeward journey, preparations were being made in the capital for a festival such as a king receives when he visits his subjects. It was May 30th. The spring sun was shining with all its brilliancy over Norway, and the Christiania fjord was teeming with yachts and small sailing boats. A light breeze played over the ruffled surface of the water, while the perfume of the budding trees on its banks shed a sweet fragrance all around. As for the town, it literally swarmed with human beings. The quays, the fortress, the very roofs of the houses were densely packed with eager crowds, all of them intently gazing seaward. Presently, a shout of welcome heard faintly in the distance announced his approach, gradually increasing in volume as he came nearer, till it merged into one continuous roar, while thousands of flags were waving overhead. Eagerly the crowds pressed forward to catch the first glimpse of his form, and when they did recognize him, their hurrahs burst forth like a storm and were caught up in the streets, answered from the windows and from the tops of houses. And when finally Nansen had disembarked and had entered a carriage, the police could no longer keep the people under control. As if with one accord, they dashed forward, and taking out the horses, harnessed themselves in their place, and dragged him through the streets of city in triumph. Yes, the Norwegian people had taken possession of Fridtjof Nansen. But up at a window there stood the old housekeeper from Store Frohen, waving her white apron while tears of joy trickled down her face. She it was who had bound up his bleeding head when years ago he had fallen and cut it on the ice. She it was to whom he had often gone when in some childish scrape. He remembered her in his hour of triumph, and as she was laughing and crying by turns and waving her apron, he dashed up the steps and gave her a loving embrace. That's the end of section 5 in chapter 1 of Into the Unknown.